as well, reading one of my favorite books, because I was reading it myself, and I was like, might as well share it with anyone that wants to, and have a discussion for anyone that wants to join. So this book is Slaughterhouse-Five, or known as the Children's Crusade, by Kurt Vonnegut. This is an original copy, so I highly enjoy this book. I've written it very little because it's the original copy, but I like to cite or do citations while I read and things. So I figured I'd go ahead and write it in a little bit, and I figured I can go ahead and share those with you while I read. Chapter 1. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden by taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to his personal enemies, killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money, God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio. More open space than Dayton has. There must have been tons of human bone meal in the ground. I went back there with an old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hannon. Oh, I'm sorry. Bernard V. O'Hare. And we made friends with the cab driver who took us to the slaughterhouse where we had been locked up at night as prisoners of war. His name was Gaiden Mueller. He took us, he told us that he was a prisoner of the Americans for a while. We asked him how it was to live under communism, and he said that it was terrible at first because everybody had to work so hard and because there wasn't much shelter or food or clothing. But things were much better now. He had a pleasant little apartment, and his daughter was getting an excellent education. His mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. He sent O'Hare a postcard at Christmas time, and here's what it said. I wish you and your family also, as to your friend. Sorry, the head startled me. I wish you and your family also, as to your friend, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I hope that we'll meet again in a world of peace, freedom, and a taxi cab, if the accident will. I like that very much. If the accident will. I would hate to tell you that this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write a book about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I'd seen. And I thought, too, that I would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. But not many words about Dresden came from my mind then, not enough of them to make a book anyway. And not many words come now, either. When I have become an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls, with his sons full grown, I think of how useless the Dresden part of my memory have been, and yet how tempting Dresden has been to write about, and I am reminded of the famous lyrics. There was a young man from Stamboul who soliloquied thus to his tool. You look at my wealth, and you ruined my health, and now you won't pee, you old fool. And I reminded too of the song that goes, "My name is Jan Jansen. I work in Wisconsin. I work in a lumber mill there. The people I meet when I walk down the street then say, 'What's your name?' And I say, 'My name is Jan Jansen. I work in Wisconsin.' And so on to infinity. Over the years, people I've met have often asked me what I'm working on, and I've usually replied that the main thing was the book about Dresden. I said to Harrison Starr, the movie maker, one time, and he raised his eyebrows and inquired, 'Is it an anti-war book?' You know, yet yes, I said. I guess. You know what I say to people when I hear they're writing an anti-war book? No, what do you say, Harrison Starr? I say, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? What he meant, of course, was that there would have always been wars and that they were as easy to stop as glaciers. I believe that too. And even if wars didn't keep coming like glaciers, there would still be plain old death. Anybody want to say anything before I keep going? Open eyes? No? Okay. When I was somewhat younger, working on my famous Dresden book, I asked an old war buddy named Bernard V. O'Hare if I could come to see him. He was a district attorney in Pennsylvania. I was a writer on Cape Cod. We had been privates in the war, infantry scouts. We had never expected to make any money after the war, but we were doing quite well. I had the Bell Telephone Company find him for me. They were wonderful that way. I have this disease late at night sometimes involving alcohol on the telephone. I get drunk and I drive my wife away with a breath like mustard gas and roses. And then, speaking gravely and elegantly into the telephone, I ask the telephone operator to connect me with his friend, or that one, from who I have not heard in years. I got O'Hare on the line in this way. He is short and I am tall. We were Mutt and Jeff in the war. We were captured together in the war. I told him who I was on the telephone. He had no trouble believing me. He was up. He was reading. Everybody else in the house was asleep. Listen, I said. I'm writing this book about Dresden. I'd like some help remembering stuff. I wonder if I could come down and see you, and we could drink and talk and remember. He was unenthusiastic. He said he couldn't remember much. He told me, though, to come ahead. I think the climax of the book will be the execution of poor old Edgar Derby, I said. The irony is so great. A whole city gets burned down, thousands and thousands of people are killed, and there is one American foot soldier is arrested in the ruins for taking a teapot, and he's given a regular trial, and he's shot by a firing squad. Hmm, said O'Hare. Don't you think that's really where the climax should come? I don't know anything about that, he said. That's your trade, not mine. As a trafficker in climax and thrills, the characterization and wonderful dialogue and suspense and give me one second. Confrontation. I had outlined the Dresden story many times. The best outline I ever made, or anyway the prettiest one, was on the back of a roll of wallpaper. I used my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. One end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, and the other end was the end. And then there were that was all the middle, which was the middle. and the blue line met the red line, and then the red line met the yellow line, and the yellow line stopped because the character had died, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange crossing, hatching, and all the lines that were still alive passed through it, came out the other side. The end, where all the lines stopped, was a beet field on the Elbe outside of Halle. The rain was coming down. The war in Europe had been over for a couple of weeks, and we were formed in ranks with Russian soldiers guarding us. Enlisted men, Americans, Dutchmen, Belgians, Frenchmen, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, thousands of us, about to stop being prisoners of war. And on the other side of the field were thousands of Russians, Poles, and Latvians, and so on, guarded by American soldiers. An exchange was made there in the rain, 1 for 1. O'Hare and I climbed into the back of an American truck with a lot of others. O'Hare didn't have any souvenirs. Almost everyone else did. I had a ceremonial Luftwaffe saber, still do. The rabid little American I can call Paul Lazaro in this book had about a quarter mount, a quarter of diamonds and emeralds and rubies and so on. He had taken these from dead people in the cellars of Dresden, so it goes. An idiotic Englishman who had lost all his teeth somewhere had this souvenir in a canvas bag. The bag was resting on my instep. He would peek into the bag every now and then he would roll his eyes and swivel his scrawny neck, trying to catch people looking covertly at his bag. And he would bounce the bag on my instep. I thought the bouncing was an accident, but I was mistaken. He had to show somebody what was in the bag, and he had decided he could trust me. He caught my eye, winked, opened the bag. There was a plaster mold of the Eiffel Tower in there. It was painted gold. It had a clock on it. "There's a smashin' thing," he said. And we were flown to the rest camp in France, where we were fed chocolate malted milkshakes and other rich foods until we were all covered with baby fat. Then we were sent home, and I married a pretty girl who was covered in baby fat too. And we had babies, and they were all grown up, and now I'm an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls. My name is Jan Janssen. I work in Wisconsin. I work in the lumber mill there. Sometimes I try to call up old girlfriends on the telephone late at night after my wife has gone to bed. "Operator, I wonder if you could give me the number of Miss So-and-so. I think she lives at such and such." "I'm sorry, sir, there's no such listing." "Thanks, operator." "Thanks just the same." And I let the dog out, or I let him in, and we talk some. I let him know I like him, and he lets me know he likes me. He doesn't mind the smell of mustard gas and roses. "You all right, Sandy?" I say to the dog. "You know that, Sandy? You're okay." Sometimes I turn on the radio and listen to talk programs from Boston and New York. I can't stand recorded music if I've been drinking a good deal. Sooner or later I think about my education sometimes. I went to the University of Chicago for a while after the Second World War. I was a student in the Department of Anthropology at the time. At the time they were teaching that there was absolutely no difference between anybody. They may still be teaching that. Another thing that they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, "You know, you never wrote a story with a villain in it." I told him that was one thing I learned in college after the war. I find it interesting that he says so it goes after every death in the book, except for when his father dies. That is definitely probably one of the more interesting things in this. While I was studying to be an anthropologist, I was also working as a police reporter for a famous Chicago news station bureau for $28 a week. To think that was a lot back then. One time they switched me from night shift to day shift, so I worked 16 hours straight. They were supported by all the newspapers in town and the AP and the UP and all that. And we would cover the courts and the police stations and the fire department and the Coast Guard out on Lake Michigan and all that. We were connected to the institutions that supported us by means of tubes that ran under the streets of Chicago. Reporters would telephone in stories to writers wearing headphones, and the writers would stencil the stories on monograph sheets, and the stories were mimeographed, I think that's how you say that, and stuffed into the brass and velvet cartridges, which the pneumatic tubes ate. The very toughest reporters and writers were women who had taken over the jobs of men who'd gone to war. And the first story I cut. Let me reread that. The very toughest reporters and writers were women who had taken over the jobs of men who'd gone to the war. And the first story I covered, I had to dedicate over the. Sorry, I'm having speaking issues. And the first story I covered, I had to dictate over the telephone to one of those beastly girls. It was about a young veteran who had taken a job running an old-fashioned elevator in an office building. The elevator door on the first floor was ornamental iron laced. Sorry. Words dashed, it's harder to read. The elevator on the first floor was ornamental iron lace. Iron ivory snaked in and out of the holes. There was an iron twig with two iron lovebirds perched upon it. The veteran decided to take his car into the basement, and he closed the door and stared down, but his wedding ring was caught in all the ornaments, so he was hoisted into the air, and the floor of the car went down, dropped onto from under him, and the top of the car squashed him. So it goes. So I phoned this in, and the woman who was going to cut the stencil asked me, "What did his wife say?" She doesn't know yet, I said. It just happened. Call her up and get a statement. What? Tell her you're Captain Finn from the police department. Say that you have some sad news. Give her the news and see what she says. So I did. she said, about what you would expect her to say. There was a baby and so on. When I got back to the office, the woman writer asked me, just for her own information, what the squashed guy had looked like when he was squashed. I told her. Did it bother you? She said. She was eating a Three Musketeers candy bar. Heck no, Nancy, I said. I've seen lots worse than that in the war. Makes you think that at first he questioned what she wanted him to do, and then he seemed to not really care after she told him to do it. Even then, I was supposedly writing a book about Dresden. It wasn't a famous air raid back then in America. Not many Americans knew how much worse it had been than Hiroshima. For instance, I didn't know that either. There hadn't been much publicity. I happened to tell the University of Chicago professor at a cocktail party about the raid as I had seen it, about the book I would write. He was a member of the thing called the Committee of Social Thought, and he told me that the concentration camps, and he told me about the concentration camps, and about how the Germans had made soap and candles out of the fat of dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know, I know, I know. It's interesting, he doesn't say so it goes there either. There's very few instances in the book where he doesn't say it. He says and so on, but I mean I think he's just trying to make it move quicker. World War II had certainly made everybody very tough, and I had become a public relations man for General Electric in Startendale, New York. Yeah, we're gonna go with that for the word. And a volunteer fireman in the village of Alps, where I had bought my first home. My boss there was one of the toughest guys I ever hoped to meet. I had been a lieutenant colonel in the public relations in Baltimore while I was in Chicago. He joined the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a very tough church indeed. He used to ask me sneeringly sometimes why I hadn't been an officer, as though I'd done something wrong. My wife and I had lost our fat baby. Those were our scrawny years. We had we had a lot of scrawny veterans and their scrawny wives and for friends. The nicest veterans, I thought, the kindest and funniest ones, the ones who'd hated the war the most, were the ones who'd really fought. I wrote the Air Force back then, asking for the details about the raids on Dresden, who ordered it, how many planes did it, why they did it, what desirable results there had been, and so on. I was answered by a man like myself, was in public relations. He said that he was sorry, but that information was top secret still. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, secret, my God, for whom? We were United World Federalists back then. I don't know what we are now. Telephoners, I guess. We telephone a lot. Or I do, anyway, late at night. I'm going to read just a little bit more, and then we'll be done for tonight. A couple of weeks after I telephoned my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, I really did go to see him. It must have been in 1964 or so. Whatever the last year was for New York World's Fair. Ehu, Fages, La Butter, Annie. My name is Jan Janssen. There was a young man from Istanbul. I took 2 little girls with me, my daughter Nanny and her best friend, Elsa Mitchell. They had never been off Cape Cod before. When we saw a river, we had to stop so they could stand by it and think about it for a while. They had never seen water in that long and narrow, unsalted form before. The river was the Hudson. There were carp in there, and we saw them. They were as big as atomic submarines. We saw waterfalls too, streams jumping off cliffs into the valley of Delaware. There were lots of things to stop and see. And then it was time to go. Always time to go. Little girls were wearing white party dresses and black party shoes. Go. And the sun went down, and we got supper and an Italian place, and then I knocked on the front door of the beautiful stone house of Bernard V. O'Hare. I was carrying a bottle of Irish whiskey, like a dinner bell. And we will stop there for tonight. We are on the bottom of page 15. And I'll give my thoughts on the book so far. I mean, frick, I dropped my pen. I mean, I've read it multiple times. It's one of my favorite books. In fact, later in the book, there are actually pictures, and I will be showing the pictures to the camera. But I have a tattoo on my shoulder that you might have catched a couple of glimpses of from the book, and I will show the tattoo when the picture in the book comes up, because I don't want to give anything away. But I mean, so far it's a really good book. I highly enjoy it. It's definitely one of my favorites because I have a tattoo of it. And if you want to go ahead and keep reading past me, that's fine. I'll probably be reading this over the next week or so, and then I'll pick a couple of books out and let people choose or something like that. Maybe. I haven't decided yet. But maybe if I get more people in here next time, like anyone more than me, we will have some good discussions about it. I will probably be on later tomorrow, specifically just because I have homework and things I have to get done. But like, this is Slaughterhouse 5, Kurt Vonnegut, otherwise known as the Children's Crusade, which we'll get into that later in the book. And yeah, have a great night, and I've enjoyed spending these 30 minutes reading to you guys. Goodbye.